All right. Hey, thanks for coming out to the talk. Our talk is Cash is King, Who's Wearing Your Crown? Just a little background about the talk. I gave this, the first version of this talk at Black Hat Abu Dhabi last December. I gave it with a coworker of mine who is a CPA. So that's actually where we got the idea for this talk, was because he's got a very deep financial background. So that'd be kind of cool of, let's look at accounting systems and how can we manipulate them and hack them, but not just to hack them to break into them, but to actually commit fraud. And that's really the cool thing about this talk. We're going to be focused very much on the fraud side. So who likes money? Yeah. Everybody should raise their hand. Absolutely. And that's why we're doing this stuff, because we like money. We want to make money, and we want to do it so you can't get detected. So that's what our talk's going to be about. So kind of just give you an overview of what we're going to be covering. We're going to start just a very basic introduction to accounting fraud, what's out there, what are the attacks, what are the types of fraud that we see. And we're going to pick on Microsoft for a little bit, specifically Dynamics Great Plains. So we're going to go into some detail on what that is and why it became our victim. And then we'll talk about some fraud that we're going to actually demonstrate live. We're going to do a live demo of a specific attack. So we're going to be talking about electronic check fraud. Pretty cool. So we'll get into that, and then we'll go through a couple other attacks. And then one thing, we'll touch very lightly on some of the controls to help prevent some of these attacks. Since this is DerbyCon, we want to talk about exploitation, we talk about the cool stuff. Spencer's really cool code that he wrote. It's really cutting edge stuff here. So we want to put a big focus on demonstrations and showing you how this stuff works, and the danger that we're going to start seeing more of this happen here in the near future, I would suspect. So about me, my name is Tom Eston. I'm the manager of Secure State's Attack and Defense Team. I grew up as a pen tester. That was basically my life before I became a manager. I still get the pen test, which is cool. But I manage the team now at Secure State. I'm an OWASP contributor, SANS mentor. I teach the SANS Sec 542 web app pen testing class for SANS. And I'm also a security blogger and a podcast co-host, social media security podcast, the former, now defunct Security Justice podcast. I know, very sad. And then we speak all over the place, blackhat.com and things like that.
And my name is Mcintyre. I do a lot of the research and development on the R&I team at Secure State. So I'm a big believer in open source, and so I've contributed to a few projects. Those are the ones I'm particularly proud of. And like Tom, I have also spoken at a few conferences. So my background.
So let's tell a little story about a man named Peter Gibbons. Everyone familiar about Peter Gibbons? He's a newly promoted manager in a fantastic company called Mcintyre, right? Well, he gets this idea one day, because he really doesn't like his company, that he's going to find a way to steal some money from Mcintyre, because he just really doesn't like that place. Neither does his coworkers. So, he's got his 3.5-inch floppy. I missed that. Those were the golden days, weren't they? And he's, placing that disk into what actually looks like a 486, but it's actually a Mac. I don't know, it's Hollywood. Just go with it. So he puts the disk in, he looks around, no one's going to see me, and we start copying files, right? So here's our virus being uploaded. Now, what's the problem with this? Who remembers from the movie? That, right? They weren't expecting in 2 weeks to get that much money, right? So this is kind of just to bring this up of, if you carefully do a fraud-related type of attack, you can't mess it up, just like in the movie, right? There's those mundane details, right? It's just missing a decimal point. Well, our attacks, we're not going to make a mundane detail mistake. We're actually going to show how to commit these frauds without making any mistakes, which is kind of cool. So we're going to kind of do like an office space attack in real life. So real briefly, talking about accounting fraud, as pen testers and as hackers, we break in, it's getting very easy, on a pen test. You got all that low-hanging fruit, right? Default accounts, passwords, MSO8, 67, we'll get to that in a minute. And it's very easy to evade these technical controls. And typically pen testers find, the data, right? Passwords, social security numbers, PCI data, credit cards, proprietary information. This is old hat. This is nothing new. We do it all the time. Hey, who remembers this from the first DerbyCon? Yeah, the birthday cake, right? Happy birthday, MSO8. Yeah, so this is the most common common issue that we still find on client networks. We find one system with this vulnerability, and we lead to domain admin very quickly. It's a 5-year-old vulnerability, and for some reason we still find it. So it's very easy. Once we find a vulnerable system like this, it's easy to exploit and compromise the entire network, which includes financial systems. So what if we could really demonstrate the real business risk? Okay, so getting credit card numbers, socials, that kind of thing, yeah, that's all great and everything, but typically to a company, it's the financial risk that really hits their bottom line. If I can manipulate that, if I can steal money from the company, that's even better from an attacker standpoint. And also thinking about testing some of the non-technical controls. So what is the accounting department doing? How are they even utilizing some of the IT controls that are put in place to help prevent fraud? What does that look like? How are they responding? Do they even know what to do in case if somebody's trying to steal money from the company? So we are putting an emphasis in this talk on how to test and what are the concerns that we need to look at from an accounting perspective. So we all know the technical controls. We know confidentiality, integrity, availability, all meant to protect data, right? But the problem is technical controls can only go so far, and they will fail, right? So what do you rely on? There has to be something else, like non-technical controls, that can help supplement the controls that you put in place. And from an accounting perspective, if you look at this, it's very similar. They have similar requirements. Accounting data and information has to be relevant, reliable, consistent, accurate, timely. All these things are very important for financial information. So if I'm able to change any of this, manipulate it, or steal it, it becomes very advantageous to the attacker. The other problem we found with accounting controls is, depending on the company, say a small to medium-sized business, they may not have any controls in place, or they may not be properly implemented. Limited resources, usually you have a bookkeeper that does both accounts receivables and payables. They're already stressed. They may have a limited skill set. They may not even have a college degree in some cases. And they're the ones in charge of the books and responsible for cutting checks to vendors and paying people. So that is the attack vector in a lot of cases. And of course, we touch on this in a couple areas. Accounting departments sometimes don't even reconcile the accounts every month. So does what's in the bank actually match what's in your books? We find a lot of small, medium-sized businesses just aren't doing that as often as they need to be. So your traditional accounting fraud, you have your insider embezzlement, overstating profits, external check fraud. We're going to be looking at the electronic form of check fraud in our demonstrations today. And of course, insider fraud. So you see it in the news all the time. You got the secretary that's been dipping into the accounts and pulling things out, the Christmas fund attacks and things like that. And the primary control that keeps getting exploited is the reconciling those bank accounts. They're just not doing it and finding this fraud until it's too late. So here's some examples I pulled just from the news. I find it very shocking that most of these frauds that happen are in the millions of dollars. There's not just $200 here, $300 here. These are very, very large amounts of money that's being stolen. And this is still being stolen in the traditional sense, right? People walking up to a bank, cashing a check, making fake checks. The old school ways of committing fraud still happens. Frank Abagnale, right? Probably one of the greatest check fraudsters in history. He's even quoted saying that what he did in his youth is hundreds of times easier today because technology truly breeds crime. And that's a lot what we're going to be talking about here shortly with our demonstrations. So let's pick on Microsoft a little bit. So here is a Great Plains software family picture from 1989. This is actually before Spencer was born. Yep, that's right. So Great Plains Software was the original creators of Dynamics, and it was sold to Microsoft. I'm sorry. We now belong to Steve Ballmer, right? I mean, why does everyone hate Steve Ballmer? Developers? Yeah. So poor Steve, he now owns Great Plains. So a little bit about Dynamics. It is one of the most popular accounting systems in the world for medium to large businesses. We find that most small businesses are still kind of using the QuickBooks, Peachtree, some of the off-the-shelf type of systems. I wanted to focus on kind of the next level before you get to a system like SAP or Oracle Financials. We will talk about those systems here in a little bit, but for this talk we want to focus on Great Plains. That number is correct. 1.1 billion was sold for in the year 2000. That is a lot of cash for a software company. It was written in Dexterity, which is a proprietary coding language for that product specifically. And as of this year, 43,000 companies across the world are using Dynamics GP. So how Dynamics works, out of the box, there is no Windows authentication per se, so utilizing Active Directory. There are third-party plugins, basically, or components that you can add on top of GP to have that integration, but all your user accounts are managed, stored, and created by the SQL Server. Okay, so that's very important for some of the attacks we're going to talk about. Obviously, the SA account is the most powerful. There is a DynSA account, which is actually like a delegation account. So I think of it as like a power user that can do certain things in GP, not quite as powerful as the SA. But of course, you have your regular users, so your accountants, your payable clerks, things like that, that can log into the system that way. Here's kind of a high-level overview of kind of how it works. So all of the older versions of GP up until this year are installed this way. The application is installed on the client's PC, and all it does is connect to the database. So that is very advantageous for an attacker, because I have everything that I need all on that user's system. So I can start manipulating information as it's being sent to and from the database. Very advantageous for us.
It also increases the attack surface, because there's often one database, but you have multiple accounts using it. So now we have multiple systems that we can attack.
Exactly. So they just started this year with the latest version of GP, slowly moving it into more of a web-based, client-server model. However, what we're finding is most companies are reverting back to the desktop methods because there's a lot of features that's not quite supported yet in the newer versions. So it's quite interesting that we're going to start seeing it evolve more from this client-server architecture to more of a web-based infrastructure pretty soon. Lots of companies are going to be using these older versions. Why would a company upgrade Dynamics? The reason they wouldn't have to, because that costs money, costs time, costs new training, and how often are accounting systems changing? A debit is a debit, a credit is a credit. There's not much difference. So a lot of companies just don't feel the need to upgrade to the latest versions of this product here. So as an attacker, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to try to locate the GP systems in the database. So typically on a pen test, right, we're going to look for those types of systems, the accounting systems specifically. They can be named GP. We've seen Great Plains, more things named as accounting or finance. Very simple to find that. So this is really our reconnaissance phase that we're doing. Other things, we want to see where the database is. So a couple ways that we found that it's you can locate it, like the company intranet. So our company's intranet usually reveals, where the accounting system is installed, instructions or reference guides of how to use the system, install the system. Typically we find that network shares are used to install the application, and those have things like config files, which tell us where the database server is located, and then we can start poking around from there. But reconnaissance is a very, very important piece of this. So attack vectors, vulnerabilities in GP, there have been some in the past, nothing recently, but there's been your DOS, over vulnerabilities in version 9 or lower. We're specifically going to attack in version 10, as we'll show in this demo very shortly. There were some other issues that have been debunked by Microsoft as not really issues, but a lot of things we find in GP come down to database configuration. Right? So we have the local admin group that's added to the sysadmin rule on the SQL server. Guess who's in the local admin group usually? Domain admins, right? And now I can compromise the entire network and get to the financial systems very easily with those types of misconfigurations. So those are the things that we're going to look for. And so the attacks, we're really going to focus on specifically number 3, but we can compromise the system through the database directly, where we can hijack the accounts, send the accountant a phishing email, gather the GP credentials, and get in that way. So social engineering would always work. But we really want to focus here on the custom malware, on the client specifically, and really customize this attack to the client or the customer. So the goal, modify, create GP database entries, and this is easy with direct access to the SQL server. So once I'm on the network and I know where that financial SQL server is, I'm going to attack it. I'm going to start looking at the database itself. But how do you know what to modify? So as a pen tester, I don't have a financial background. I don't have an accountant's level or CPA skill or anything like that. So I have to understand what's stored in the database and how it's stored. So we find, we figure out what the naming conventions are for the tables. There's lots of really neat reference guides. Like this table here. You could just Google for table prefix identification, and now I can start customizing my attacks towards the financial system, because now I know where the general ledger is, I know where the payroll system is, and I know where the inventory is. So as a pen tester and attacker, this is very valuable information to start digging into these different types of systems. Here's some of the identifiers. So simply PM1000, so that's your payables management work table. All you do is put the prefix with the identifier, and now you have the table function. And now the fun part, let's attack the user. We love attacking the users. Who are we going to target? We're going to target the accounting department, the controller, bookkeeper, the CFO, and the accountant. And one thing I want to mention about especially the bookkeeper or controller positions, typically these are lower paid positions. They're both in a small, medium-sized business. They're doing a lot. They're doing an enormous amount of work, and they're very stressed. So think of that from a social engineering perspective. These are the people that you're going to target, because it's almost too easy in some cases, because they don't have the training, they don't have the security awareness, and it becomes very easy to target these users. And the goal here, obviously, we want to compromise the user's workstation. So we want to get that login and password. We want to compromise other workstations and pivot to the accounting department, and of course end up with a backdoor, right, where we can actually now log in, or we can actually manipulate GP specifically and install our own code on that user system and commit fraud. So here's a scenario. Harvest, accounting department usernames and emails via LinkedIn, create a targeted phishing email, and then create a link to a download malicious attachment. So we do something simple as click here, install the latest GP patch. Awesome. They click it, and then mayhem ensues, which we'll talk about here in a minute.
Alright, so I'm going to actually talk about the malware that we developed to run the proof of concept of scenario number 3 that we just talked about. So I created it. This is the second version. For the first version of the talk, it had less features, and it actually required you to install it with a independent script. That doesn't work well for pen testers. We wanted it to be completely integrated into Metasploit Interpreter, because everything's better with Metasploit Interpreter, right? So it's up on GitHub right there. That's the link to it. We're going to have that at the very end too, so if you want to write that down. It's all open source, so every component of it is open source, but the compiled component is already compiled, but you shouldn't trust me. You should actually check it out yourself and do it. You shouldn't. Alright, so how does this actually work? So what we do is, after we've compromised the system, we have Interpreter via installing a Great Plains patch or an exploit or what have you. And what we're going to do is we're going to upload a library, and we're going to inject it into the Dynamics process, very plain from there. And then from there, we're going to actually hook into the ODBC library, which Dynamics is using to execute the SQL queries. And from there, we're going to monitor that and then copy information so that we can then use it to inject our own Evo queries and manipulate the database as the authenticated user. We don't ever have to touch the password. We don't have to be authenticated. They can change the password. We don't care, because we have that authenticated session in memory. Alright, no installation is required. It affects the process at runtime, so we just upload the DLL and inject it, so we don't have to have administrative rights. It helps if you're a system or an admin, you can't elevate yourself to system and then infect any process. But if you're infected as the user that's running Dynamics, then you're okay from there, which is actually what we're going to show in our scenario. Alright, so like I said, we're going to start out with interpreter session open via exploit or what have you. Whatever we need to do to get that session. We have included in our set of modules, because we're releasing a set of modules to actually do this functionality, is we have an install module, which is going to identify the Dynamics process for us, upload the DLL, and then inject it. Now, step 3 is very, very key, is because we're monitoring that process as it's running, the user has to be using it in order for us to get a valid handle to interact with the database. Now, the only time this would ever really be a problem is if the accountant leaves Dynamics open and goes out to lunch and isn't using it all. Because what we found out is pretty much anything you click within the application causes some type of SQL query to be executed, so we can get the handle from that. Even if you minimize the application and open it in some views, it refreshes it, so it's constantly doing SQL queries. So this isn't usually a problem. If the accountant is physically not there, then it's likely you're going to have to wait for them to return in order for this to work. So once we have an authenticated handle in the SQL database, we're going to inject our own evil SQL queries, and we're going to, first of all, demonstrate creating a vendor, and then after we create a vendor, we want to pay ourselves, because that's how we get our money. And so we're going to do a little bit of reconnaissance, and we're going to check out their checkbooks, because we want to know how much money they have and where it's coming from, so that we don't ideally pay too much to us and put them in the negatives, because that would be a big red flag. We don't want to get caught. So
what's kind of cool too is you can take these modules and use them on a pen test. So once you know a company's using Dynamics and you want to demonstrate this, without actually committing the fraud yourself, because obviously we're taking it to the completely next level here, but just the reconnaissance modules that he's written can show you a lot of information and demonstrate some real serious risk here.
Yep. And after that, we profit because we got the money. Everybody's happy. Beer time. All right, so like I said, Mayhem works by installing a couple of hooks. The key hook that we have is the SQL outlook statement. So that way, that's where all of the calls in order to create the queries go through. So that way the handle can be copied. So we hook that with a tiny little stub that copies the last seen handle into a place that we can then use for our own queries. We monitor that, and like I said, we have a channel back to us. It creates a named pipe on the system that we then use Interpreter to open and communicate with, sort of like an RPC type architecture. We can issue commands to it to execute queries and get information from the database and send it to it. So it's conceptually kind of similar to Mimikatz. Everybody likes Mimikatz, but the way that it works is you install DLL and it opens up a handle and you can communicate with it. And Mimikatz is awesome, so why not be like Mimikatz? Alright, so this is what we're going to do today. Like I said, we're going to go through the first part of Effective Dynamics, pretty plain Jane, but you got to do it. After that, we're going to create a new evil vendor, and then we're going to pay them, because that's how we want to get our money. And from there, the chaos ensues. And like I said, we're doing all this on MS Dynamics 10. So, alright, we're going to hook all the functions, stealing all the handles. Let's pray the demo, guys.
We do have video backup.
Yes, we do.
Just in case the demo guys aren't happy. But when he fired at Metasploit earlier in the speaker room, he got the cow. So he got the Metasploit cow, and that usually means, yeah, we're in luck.
Alright, this time I have Egypt Love Shell, so
that's just as good.
Alright, yeah, we'll go with that. Okay, so as you guys can see here, I have my session, right? Alright, so I'm not running as administrator. This is going to fail. So, oh no, we can't get system. That sucks. Sysinfo, so we're running this on Server 2008, so seriously, it's this box over here. So the first thing we have to do is, this over here is going to be what the account's looking at, because they're working in Dynamics Great Plains. This is their workstation specifically. So they're going to go about their day and fire up Great Plains. And over here from the attacker, we're going to do a PS. Check to see if Dynamics is here. Okay, we actually do see that Dynamics has been started, so we are good to start causing some mayhem. So this is the first module that we have right here. This is the install module that I mentioned. Pretty simple. No options. Just takes the session, and we're going to run this. So identify the process, upload the DLL, and inject it. So from here, this process has been backdoored and is infected with our code so that we can manipulate it. Shame on me, but my password is actually SA into the database.
And you can actually log in version 10 with the SA account, which is awesome. Just saying.
Everybody's happy. So Dynamics is really slow, so let's just give this a minute to go up. Oh no, we're running a test code, so the date's off. That was telling us, but we got a little bit of time. Alright, so we're going to show that there is currently no DerbyCon vendor because DerbyCon deserves to get paid.
We're going to pay Dave Kennedy a little bit more money. He did such a great job with the cons this year, so.
Okay, so there is no Derby. Let's scroll down to the D's here. Alright, so it goes from C, DI, DO, EL. So let's make a DerbyCon user so we can pay them. So these is the list of all the models. We're going to hit on each one of them individually here. These are all released and are all on GitHub. I have the link that we showed. So you don't. But
they could be included in the program?
yes, they absolutely can, but I'm kind of cheating just a little bit because remember how I said the function has to be called in order for us to get the information? Later on, when I show you the get credentials module, unless it takes a really long time, you won't get the credentials. So I'll say that the get credentials module, it isn't magic. They have to actually, that function has to be called. But if you only want to inject SQL queries, then you can do it past the login. It doesn't matter. You can inject it whenever you want.
We're going to be getting more into the SQL queries here in a minute because there's some super cool stuff you can do, even outside of Dynamics with the stuff they've written.
So the answer is yes, if you want the get credentials module to work. It is called sometimes, but only if it like times out. We're not going to stand up here for 15 minutes waiting for it to time out. Unless you guys want us to. All right, so those are our options. All right, so that module completed successfully. So we're going to come back over here to Dynamics. We're going to close on out of this. Search for Derby. And there we go. DerbyCon has been added. Alright, so now that we have a vendor, we want to pay them, like I said. So we want to make sure, we want to see what the type of checkbooks the company has so that we can issue ourselves payment. So we use okay, so this one just takes a session. Run this one right here. Oh, that looks bad on the low resolution. But what we see right here is we have the checkbook IDs, the description, bank IDs, the currencies. You know yourself, you're paying yourself in US dollars and pesos because I prefer dollars. Bank account number, which is always helpful. And finally, we know how much they have. That's the current balance, that little number down there. So we're going to pick on this Kimmel Bank here. So we're actually going to issue our payment from Uptown Trust. Alright, so now let's check out what transactions have been done to a DerbyCon. There we go, $31,337.
I just got richer. Awesome.
Yes, you did.
So what's cool about this is unless the accounting department is checking what checks have been cut, and I'm being serious, a lot of them just print the checks every month. Their payables department just whips out a bunch of checks, puts them in an envelope, and ships them off. And they don't realize that if this was the case, someone was doing these manipulations for fraud, they wouldn't have any idea until later when they actually reconcile the bank accounts, and that may be several months down the road. So somebody could get away with this for quite a while.
Alright, so next up we have a second demo. So we want to divide up the demos into the Dynamics specific features and the features that are not Dynamics specific, which is what I'm going to demo now. So we had a couple more modules that we want to show you guys. One is the query module, which is actually pretty much what the get checkbooks module was wrapping. It already has the query preset into it, so you don't need to know what you're looking for. But this is going to allow us to execute arbitrary SQL queries on the system. So if you remember a while ago, I actually did log in as SA and I could not get system, but I'm actually going to use this module to use the XP command shell to actually execute commands as system. I am terrible at writing, so I had the query and all the options with default settings that work pretty well. And there we go, running commands as system. Copy this back over. You can figure out. This is why I have them all set. And there we go. Okay, so we're running commands as system now. So even though we can't get system on the machine, we're running commands as system on the SQL server. In this case, the SQL server is running on the same box, but if it were someplace else, we'd have system level access to that one specifically. And then finally, last one we got in our bag of tricks. Is the Get Credentials module. So this hooked the SQL Connect A function, and so it copies over the value out of the service string, the username, and the password. And like I said, so the caveat of this one, this looks really cool, but the function does have to be called while Dynamics has been infected. So if you wait long enough, you'll probably be in good shape, but chances of you actually infecting the process before they log in, not so great. But if you wait long enough to run it all day, it should be okay. And that's all we got. So like from this point right here, we could actually log in directly to the SQL Server because we have the credentials ourselves.
And so this kind of sets it up for other accounting systems. Really, and I talk about this in the slide, is if it's using ODBC, so it has a Microsoft backend, so Oracle, SAP, anything like that, we could potentially take this and do the same types of things. So it really is setting the stage for going into the bigger accounting systems and financial systems using a lot of these similar techniques.
We don't modify Dynamics at all. This is only installing a couple of hooks in the ODBC library that it loads. So it would be minimal modifications to pretty much do the SQL queries probably. Right, next up.
All right, so a couple of other attacks that we're going to mention. We have a full white paper with a lot of other types of fraud attacks, and because of time, we're only going to mention some of the cool stuff. But so Spencer demonstrated just creating a brand new vendor. Well, how about modifying an existing vendor? It's even easier, right? So all you got to do is change the check name, who it's made out to, and then the address. So that goes to my PO box or my address, and now I've got a large check. You can also do this from the back end. So like Spencer was saying, as long as I have access to the SQL Server, I can just change a couple queries and then modify that directly within the SQL Server. This is just showing a screenshot of SQL Enterprise Manager, just showing you, where are things at and what I would need to modify. And then this one's fun, so increasing a customer credit limit. So say you're a business that works on credit, and I'm selling a bunch of widgets to, say, a supplier or something like that. Typically, those companies have a credit line for that customer, so they can, order a certain amount under credit. Well, I can change that credit to either unlimited to no credit. I can take that customer, maybe that supplier is a competitor to me, and I want to take them out. I can change that quite easily in Dynamics and really mess that up. And then the other cool thing is, well, what if I create a customer and then create myself a refund, right? So I actually overcharge or overpaid for a product. Automatically, every quarter when these checks go out or every month, I'm going to be issued a nice big fat refund. And in this case, I'm going to be issued a refund for $50,000. Pretty cool. Other things, so of course, it's endless, right? We can steal banking information, to do wire transfers, things like that. Credit card data is a given, depending if it's encrypted or not, things like that. Payroll information, which usually includes social security numbers, so identity theft isn't off the table. And of course, access and modify private financial records. Okay, this is kind of neat, right? So especially if the company is publicly traded, the CFO of that company is signing off, to the SEC saying, hey, our financials are sound, and there's no problems here. We had an interesting conversation with some accountants, and they were concerned because in an audit, when they're signing off on these financials, what if it was known that there was malware like this that was found on the accountant system or the CFO system? Would it invalidate those financial records and thus causing their stock to drop very quickly? It's an interesting kind of attack. And auditors are kind of like stunned, like, yeah, we've never encountered anything like that yet because there hasn't been anything that targets the financial systems directly. And then we've seen banking trojans, right, that hijack the browser and then do wire transfers. That's kind of taking that concept and moving it over now to financial systems specifically, which makes this so cool. So the question we get a lot is, what about Oracle, SAP, the bigger ERP systems? Yes, we can. We can attack other ERP systems. Like I said, ODBC, if that's being used, we can hijack that. If it's not being used, there will probably be a little more custom coding and things that we would have to do. But it definitely is possible. And you need to know, an intimate knowledge of the database systems.
What we're doing is not an exploit in any sense of the word. It's just how things are made.
Exactly. So if I can hijack those database connections in any system, I can commit this type of fraud. So it kind of highlights the internal threat a little bit more. So you've got a disgruntled SAP administrator that knows these systems inside and out. This could be a kind of an advantageous attack to commit because they have that intimate knowledge of the systems. So real briefly, because the attack stuff is the fun part, but we got to talk a little bit about controls. But when it comes to bank reconciliation, the problem that we find is that companies aren't doing it enough. Some of your bigger, large corporations obviously have a big process built in, but a small, medium-sized business are not going to have the types of controls, or they're not going to have the typical accounting reconciliation processes that they need. So they do it kind of ad hoc when they need to, when they're getting audited or they're doing things like that. That's when they're running the balance. But you have to do these types of checks monthly is the recommendation, and that comes straight from the CPA. Other accounting controls, so there are a lot of types of anti-fraud controls that are out there that can be used. Positive pay is something that your bank would have, that you have to sign up for, that basically matches up the checks with what's actually in the account. A lot of that stuff costs money. Small, medium-sized businesses are not going to spend that kind of money if they don't see the need. So there is positive pay. There's processes you can put in for, when vendors are added, checking the logs, checking when things are added, marking off your vendor list, making sure those are the correct vendors that are in place, who I'm paying. And then having a customer onboarding process, credit limits, things like that, have a process behind all of this stuff. In talking with our clients and talking with all of their accountants, I find that a lot of companies just aren't doing these things yet because they just don't see the need, and a lot of this costs time and money, which they don't want to spend. Yeah.
Is there change reporting out of that's automatic?
There is no change reporting per se. There is logging that happens, but it's all in the database. So whatever the database is logging, that's what Dynamics is seeing. So you can go in.
Turned on.
Yeah. It may not be turned on, you're right. Exactly.
Also, the logging on the database, the attacks that we demonstrated were authenticated as the typical account user whenever we stumbled across an infected process while they were running it. So it'll show up that they didn't.
Which is even cooler.
Right.
Pass the blame to somebody else.
Not my problem.
If you do have that change process or change monitoring process, then somebody else will have to verify that.
That's
It will
correct.
show up in the log.
Right.
So basically, so is there a way to go into this to see if the log is how the log is being enabled? Do you all do that during the attack?
We don't check if logging is enabled because our access to the database, although we have it, is very limited. We try to keep it very minimalistic in order to keep the code secret. We do as little as we possibly can to get the job done. So no checking for logging.
But if somebody has those controls, then you're going to be caught.
It's possible. It's possible. But and that's where I get to in a second about the controls that are within Dynamics are very minimal. There's not a whole lot of logging and not a lot of things that say, hey, this is malicious activity or this is potentially a fraud type of activity. That's one of the recommendations we've had to Microsoft and other ERP vendors that they can start doing more of that. Or yeah, as an attacker, you could override that quite easily. It's kind of like when you're on a system and you're going to turn off logging or delete the logs after you're done. That is also possible. Cover your tracks. Yes, sir.
Does Mayhem have injection for both 32-bit and 64-bit ODBC drivers?
Right now, only 32-bit support, except I don't know 64-bit assembly. If you want to teach me, I'll give it a shot.
No, I know, sorry.
Yeah, 32-bit only right now. So, kind of wrap it up here. Technical controls, so don't discount defense in depth, right? But keep in mind that all it takes is one control to fail. So whether that's GP, the SQL Server configuration, user permissions, roles, AV, IPS, all those things are very important. But that's why we have to rely on some type of non-technical control. Okay, the banks are very good at doing this from, if your credit card is stolen, they have these fancy algorithms that can detect that, hey, your card is stolen because you're making a transaction either in another state or it's just not normal. So banks have gotten very good at detecting fraud after it happens and then preventing it. We want to start doing more of that. We want to start seeing what types of fraud controls can be put in on top of these accounting systems or inside the systems themselves to do more of that alerting and kind of self-hardening in the application.
So one of the other things we want to talk about is that we find it very interesting that some of the larger games that are produced by, say, Blizzard and Valve actually integrate controls into them so that you can't modify them at runtime using the techniques that we did, using the library injection and then the function hooking. It's all very well documented. This is not new stuff. What's new is how we applied it to dynamics. But what we see is that games are preventing people from doing this because users are using that to cheat in the game. So they have integrated controls, and Valve anti-cheating or VAC is actually one of the better ones that we've seen. So it's kind of interesting because in this sense, the enterprise software is behind the gaming community. And when you're actually looking into doing a lot of these techniques, it was actually funny how much time I was spending on gaming forums talking about how to actually implement the code that I did.
Yeah, so this is something that, you know, speaking with Microsoft and others, that they can start doing more of the self-defending software to really help. And then to your point about, you know, what type of things in the application can be done. So there certainly can be alerting, there could be fraud alerts, there could be, you know, alerts for malicious activity, things like that all built in, better logging, better auditing, things like that. But these ERP systems are so focused on financial information and how to process that. They rely on more of like the internal audit and those types of departments to do that checking. And it's just not enough with these types of attacks. It has to be stepped up. So final thoughts. So a lot of this talk, we're really going to highlight kind of the new age of digital fraud, that if it's not already happening, it definitely will be. So we want to bring to your attention of the businesses that you work for, you know, talk to the CFOs, talk to the financial people, and ask them about their non-technical controls. How are they doing this? Because, and really take our white paper, give it to them. We've got a lot of great feedback from the accounting community and the financial community on our research. And we really want to spread some awareness and show that this is a potential new type of fraud that's going to happen if it's not happening already. And you have to have a combination, technical as well as non-technical controls, to stop this kind of modern fraud. So, like I said, our white paper, you guys can go to that bit.ly link and download the white paper today. It's up there. Spencer's modules are on GitHub under Zero Steiner. This is his account if you're interested in taking a look at those. And then Spencer, you want to talk about the SQL queries?
I wanted to keep a slide in there with some additional interesting SQL queries that we have. So the Git useful information about the checkbooks. This is what the Git checkbooks module was essentially wrapping in the query module. And then the other one down here is to give vendor unlimited credit. Like Tom was talking about, you can manipulate the credit controls for the specific vendor. So we can set the credit limit to unlimited. And then the last one is we found that sensitive information is actually stored if they're using Dynamics for payroll. So you can get the employee's name and employee's social security number, and even the spouse's name and the spouse's social security number. So you get a lot of bang for your buck for that one. And thanks for your time.
All right, questions. We take some questions. Also, you guys can come up here after. I've got military-grade bottle openers if you're interested, and we'll give those away to you.
Thanks for your time. It would really depend on how it's implemented. If it's implemented on the server side, then chances are it would be really easy. If it's implemented on the client side, it of course would be possible, but it would take a massive amount of time. This all of what I did took a massive amount of time to figure out all the queries and everything. When you would click a button to like post a payment, it would no joke make like 300,000 lines of like SQL debug logs. I ended up writing a script just to parse it so my eyes weren't bleeding when I was looking at it, which is also on GitHub.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yep. Yes, sir.
You can access any data in the database. You really don't have to do anything complicated. You really can't.
Absolutely. Yep. That's actually one of the other, in the white paper, we actually mentioned that as one of the other attacks that we could use. So electronic funds transfer. Absolutely.
The user that's logged in has the permissions to do.
Yep.
In this case, we're logged in as SA, but so if there are other...
Typically, your accountants, unfortunately, what they do is they give those users rights to everything because there's typically only one bookkeeper at a small company, so they have all the rights to add and remove vendors, transfer funds, all that stuff. Yes, sir.
If you install Microsoft EMET on the desktop, would that prevent your exploit from working, from executing in the background, or?
I'm going over the controls that EMET provides in my head. Usually when I've looked at EMET, it's like drop and heat and like null pointer protections. Those are the only ones I
It's like
remember off the top of my head.
overflow stuff.
Yeah, because this isn't an exploit, so we're not using raw chain or anything like that. I would have to re-look at it. I don't know of anything off the top of my head that would stop it.
Wow, that stinks.
Not an exploit.
It's not an exploit, that's
Not
the
an
beauty of it.
exploit. Yes.
Is that useful on Server 2012 or Windows 8?
Yep. Would like to though, but our test environment is a little limited. But in theory, everything that uses OEDC, we should be able to modify it in a similar fashion. Yes.
That's alcohol. Yes, we accept alcohol, thank you.
Oh, you've been nice.
Oh, man. That's so messed up.
Come on, do it.
Totally used the bottle opener.
You've been nice.
Yes, you in the back, the hat.
I think you covered this already, but you can modify this framework to attack Oracle and things like that.
In theory, yes, we haven't done it, but because we are just attacking the ODBC connections, it should be pretty. It would be a similar attack in order to be able to do that. We could just apply it to the other one. Yes, the queries would all have to be different, result tables would be different, and everything. But
Yeah, thank you.
Look at that Survivor or something. Okay, everybody else come up for a bottle opener.
Liver strong.